Good morning, everyone. Excellent. I'm willing to bet that everyone in this room has a flaw. Now, not everyone's willing to say they have a flaw. Depends on who's asking. And it depends on how old you are. I think the older you are, the less you deny that you have flaws. I've got flaws. One of them is that I'm completely incapable of listening to my wife without providing solutions. Whenever we talk about something, and it's not necessarily a problem, my wife's a wonderful woman, she's never complaining, but she says something, and I'm always like, you know how you can solve that? And it's the worst thing in the world. Now, that's an individual flaw, and we all have them. There's also sort of collective flaws that we have as a species, sort of like a manufacturer's default. One of them is that we are really, really terrible at understanding vulnerability. And I will tell you a story to kind of make sure that we understand what I'm talking about. See, I study vulnerability of corporate environments for a living. But when I like to think about vulnerability and explain to people what I really mean by studying vulnerability, I like to think about my aunt that lives in Florida. And since I'm in Florida, I'm going to talk about her. See, my aunt is one of those people 3 years ago that she absolutely refuses to leave her home when there's a hurricane. She's one of those people that hold out. You know those people on the news that you see them and you're like, why aren't you guys just leaving? My aunt is one of those. And I asked her several times. One time she held out for 4 days. I asked her, why are you doing that? She says, my home's so comfortable. Every time I go in one of those shelters, it feels like the airport. And I said, okay, well, that's interesting. And she also says, you know what? I've actually never been damaged by a hurricane. And I said, okay. So about a year ago, she had to come up north, which is what us people that live in New Jersey say to Floridians when they fly that way. She had to come up north, and she had to fly at 3 p.m. out of Orlando Airport. And I called her around 8 o'clock in the morning, and she was packing up her bag, leaving for the airport at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I said, what's the matter? Why are you leaving so early? You're not supposed to leave since around 12. 4 hours early. And she said, I heard that there was a flight that was delayed at the airport. And I want to get there early, 4 hours before. Now, this is the same home that she was fighting to stay in when there was a hurricane coming, but she's willing to leave it to go to the airport because one flight's delayed. Not even hers, not even her airline. Okay? This is what I mean by we don't really know how to really measure vulnerability. You see, when we think about vulnerability, we always sort of had to look to the future, and we pull on our experiences of the past. And we think about the magnitude and the velocity of the things that happened in the past, and we believe that that's what will happen in the future. That's kind of how we live. It's a genetic flaw. You would do this and stay in your house for the comfort when a hurricane is coming, but you would leave your house early 4 hours because you heard there's a plane that's delayed. Now, in business, all of us have our personal flaw of vulnerability. In business, we have to be able to track that as well. And we track it a little bit like this. We kind of stand there. We see all the paradigms coming, okay? Big data, AI, mobility, social, cognitive, all of it, we see it coming. And we kind of plan for them in our corporate environment based on what we've experienced in the past, the internet, the cloud, the cell phone, all the things that we've experienced. And we kind of see it this way, right? We don't really see what's going on with the paradigms. We kind of know the ones that are just coming. And the truth is, they're kind of coming at us this way. They're getting higher and higher, and they're coming faster and faster. And so this puts you in a situation where you really have to think about how's my business model going to change? How's my competitive landscape going to change? How am I going to leverage these technologies? How am I going to leverage these paradigms? And they're coming faster and faster and faster. They're actually getting exponential. And if there's a techie in the room, you'll understand why these things are getting faster and higher. It almost feels like every time a new paradigm comes into an industry, you kind of have to do this. You have to jump off a cliff, take advantage of it, and hope that somehow you're going to grow some wings on the way down. Anybody feels like that? Yeah? Okay. So my job today is to kind of draw out the lines around the wings, so to speak, as we jump off these cliffs or these paradigms that are coming. I study that because I look at corporate vulnerability and really understand what they do. The thing that I'm going to talk to you about today is something called blockchain. Who here has never heard of blockchain? Good. Excellent. So there's a couple of things that I want to set the context for before I talk to you about what this is, how it's going to change your environment, and what the opportunities are for us. First, you must have heard of Bitcoin. Yes? Who has not heard of Bitcoin? Okay, good. We're in the right room. Bitcoin is to blockchain what AOL chat rooms were to the internet. It's the first instantiation of it. Blockchain is actually a protocol that helps us use technology to go about exchanging information and value differently. Now, if you remember anything from this talk, those of you who raised your hand, I want you to remember the first time you heard about blockchain. Do you remember the first time you heard about cloud? Probably not. If you don't, just remember there was a guy with red shoes on the stage, and he was talking about that thing called blockchain. Okay, this is a picture from a conference that I just did 2 days ago. I want you to think about this phenomenon and study it a little bit. Now, what is interesting about blockchain is that it has something called a distributed ledger. I don't expect you to know this stuff, and quite frankly, I'm not an expert at it. I just play around with it more than the other geeks. Okay? It's a distributed ledger, which is different from ledgers that we've had in all of commerce. In all of commerce, we keep a ledger of our assets or our information, and we don't necessarily share it with adjacent parties. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of middlemen and middlewomen that we use to share them with adjacent parties. And the reason is, one, we actually don't want to share information that we shouldn't because it's strategically important. Two, we don't trust that they're going to use it for the right reasons. And three, the mechanism is just not there to share information. Blockchain is a technology protocol that allows you to have a collection of people or a collection of organizations where everyone owns a copy of the ledger, and everyone can see when the ledger is updated, and there's a process inside that allows you to know that the ledger was updated properly. I want you to think about that for a second. Everyone have a copy of the ledger is updated in short times, and you have confidence that the ledger was updated properly. Now, it uses some existing technology. It uses crypto type technologies. It uses a concept of blocking and chaining with hashes. Don't worry, you don't need to know all that stuff. That's like asking how the cloud works, okay? I'll explain to you what this means in a second. But at the end of the day, it's one of the first times in our life that we've seen technology that actually allow us to share in a trusted environment, which is interesting for healthcare. Now, this statement is kind of powerful. Owned by all, available by permission, immutable blocks, which means you can't reverse them, chained by encryption, real-time, scalable, and at low cost. I'll give you some instantiations. The government of Estonia started using blockchain, I think in 2008, to issue digital identity to their citizens. Now, if you think about that, it might be like, oh, that's kind of cool. But digital identity is very important. It can be hacked. And you need a technology to be able to make sure that passports can't be hacked, which is a big deal. Now, on the flip side of that, I think the last estimate I saw was about 1 billion people in the world don't have identity, which means they can't prove that they are who they are, and they can't get credit cards, and they can't be a part of the financial system. So this can do things like that. I'll give you a different example of where this type of protocol can make a difference. If you create an image right now, any one of you guys tweet or create images and you put it out on the internet, someone can find it on Google and then they just use it and they cut out your name from the bottom and they use it all the time? Has that ever happened to you? Or have you ever done that to someone else's image? Okay. There is no system of ownership, no system of identity, no place where we can all share what we did, know that no one can hack the system, and be able to trust it that it actually works. So essentially, when you apply this technology, and Bitcoin's a good application of it, we see governments doing it, we see other organizations doing it, you're able to transparently record, report, and coordinate the ownership and exchange of individual and collective value. I know this sounds like snake oil. Trust me, I know. I play it in every day, okay? I'll talk to you about use cases where this can apply in healthcare. So the first thing that it does is it establishes trust between parties. The first thing that it does is it establishes trust between parties. Think about this for a second. We have been building businesses for almost 200 years, and we build businesses always assuming that the counterparty cannot be trusted. We build all of our businesses assuming that the counterparty cannot be trusted. This is why if you own a home and you have to sell it, what do you have to get? Title insurance, because you can't prove that you own the home. And the person that's buying it needs someone to actually be a middle person for that. I was just selling one of my cars on Lease Trader. You guys ever use Lease Trader? Right, so you put your car on there if you don't like it anymore and you have a lease and someone picks it up. The guy who actually is picking up my lease actually lives in the town over. We actually met up and had a beer together. It took 30 days to change the car. He had to pay $395. I had to pay $395. And Lease Trader made a ton so that we can prove to each other that we actually own the car and we're going to move it over. That's what I mean by the model of commerce that we have today is built on an assumption that the counterparty will lie. And a protocol like blockchain brings trust to the system. It also brings things like consensus. Because now you can look at the information and graph decisions from it about what you want to do. The last thing that it does is it allows you to operate in a very autonomous model. Now I'll give you some examples of this. So that was the what. The question is the so what. Okay? Think about commerce as a layered cake. You guys like red velvet? Red velvet is one of my favorite cakes, but only like 3 layers. Think about a really good multi-layered cake. Commerce kind of looks like this. First, you have to kind of organize. You have to decide whether you're an LLP or an S-Corp. Then you have to select your governance. You got to get a board of directors and how you capitalize. Then you have to figure out your network, your storage, your compute, your platforms, your application, your processes, your products. You may have consulting, you may have marketing, you may have brand. We saw an innovation at this layer called the internet. And what that did is it created abundant connectivity and information exchange, and it reset from the network up the entire competitive landscape. Companies were collapsed left and right by dot-com versions of themselves. You guys remember that? Then we saw an invention at this layer in compute and storage that created compute and storage in abundance, and as a result, cloud companies reset the entire competitive landscape. Blockchain starts at the technology layer, at the application layer, at the encryption layer. It extends down into compute and storage. It extends into network and security, and it goes up, but it also goes down. Because of the trust, because of the consensus, and because of the autonomy, it allows us to change the way we organize in order to create value. Essentially, giving us an opportunity to change the institutional design of how we do things. I want to give you an example of a changed institutional design. I know everybody uses this example, but I want you to think about Uber. You really think Uber is about the technology? There's nothing that cool about the Uber technology. It's how you change, how you arrange and organize. It's at that bottom layer. Agreed? So, we're in an information revolution. We've gone through the industrial revolution. When you think about blockchain, you have to think about it as an institutional revolution. It changes at that layer. It will change how researchers organize, how patients organize, how partners organize, how ecosystems are built. Now, none of us here have actually gone through an institutional revolution before. Anybody here over 200 years old? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, okay? Unless you're a vampire or something, which is really cool. I want to meet you. But the last time we saw an institutional revolution was when we got things like government, economy, corporation. We had figured out how to organize ourselves into these things called governments or sovereignties or corporations to coordinate value. And we do that today. The thing before that was slavery. So if you want to think about how your businesses are going to change from an institutional standpoint, you kind of have to go back a little bit before you go forward. you have to recognize that before this institutional enlightenment, the way we organized was I capture you, sir, and in exchange for not killing you, you're going to work for me. And we had kingdoms. Okay? And that was a very extrinsic motivation model. We forced you to work. I say we like I was actually a king. No, we were forced to work. Okay? Today, we're sort of in this hybrid motivation model. And where things like blockchain will take us is into an intrinsic motivation model. I'll give you a great example of an intrinsic motivation model. Wikipedia. Any external motivation? The currency is vanity. It needs some consensus and governance, but it operates in this completely different way of organizing. You know, today we look back at kingdoms and slavery, and we go, oh my God, that was terrible. Is that how you guys built castles and bridges? That's insane. 100 years from now, people are going to look back at us and go, that's how you guys worked? You got up in the morning, and at 8 o'clock, you all went to an office, and then you worked for a board of directors that didn't really tell you what they did, and you don't necessarily know who your shareholders are, and you only report every quarter, and then at 5 o'clock you leave, and hopefully you get a paycheck, and if you make billions of dollars, you don't get money from it? It's kind of silly. That's what I mean by an institutional revolution. I have to credit IBM for this slide, so I don't like to steal images, given that I study blockchain for a living. But we're really going from a model where the control was in the middle to a model where the power is on the edge. It's a really interesting time. And it stems from a technological revolution that actually creates a paradigm shift. And we're sort of good at information revolutions, right? We've all lived through the cloud. We've all lived through mobile. Nobody died. Nothing went wrong. But we are completely upside down on an institutional revolution. We understand the next technology paradigm if it looked like the last one. But we definitely don't understand it if it changes the way we organize at the bottom of that stack. So I'll talk to you about a little bit of use cases. And in my line of work, when people say use cases to me, I get a negative, visceral reaction. You know why? Because when you're thinking about the future, you don't know what the use cases are in the future. I remember I was one of those. I remember the first time I saw Twitter. I'm like, when will I ever use this in the future? Today I live on Twitter. So I made up this thing called fuse cases. What do you think fuse cases are? Future use cases. Who's going to use that tomorrow? That is awesome, right? Future use cases. I'll take you to two really quickly. Think about a patient named Sarah who has a rare disease that is terrible. I'm not even going to take time to describe the disease. Think about 1,600 people that can organize around Sarah to share their healthcare information, both those with the disease and those without the disease, on a chain where it's encrypted and it's trusted, and they can decide who sees the information and for what intent. And let's assume that that is up and running. You have 1,600 people sharing their healthcare information on a blockchain. Everybody sees everybody else's information, and they can share it with anyone they can, including a pharma company, as long as you use it for that intent. Do you think that if they're willing to sell that to us today, we would be able to guarantee that we're only using it for that intent? We can't. And these are the types of things that are starting to organize around. When you think about this, people argue all the time, well, you know, patient information is hard to share, right? You've seen patient records, they all look like this. And then you get sort of low IQ conclusions around, well, it's the technology to blame. I ask you this today, if HIPAA just disappeared, do you think we would share patient information? Yes or no? Absolutely not. It's not the technology. It's the fact that we don't trust the intent of the use. It's the fact that we cannot verify that what we actually shared our information for is what people are going to use it for. Kind of like Facebook. Facebook is hacking our attention span in exchange for advertising. And there are blockchain competitors of Facebook being built that are actually going to participate in an economy where, depending on how much I use the social network, I'm going to get that percentage of the proceeds. So when you get in a situation like this, where patients are starting to pull together, and they can trust that the usage intent of the data will work, and they can trust that the consensus around the mission They may change it and go, you know what, you can use it for a different disease. But they have to make that consensus with each other. Or they can autonomously, via smart contracts, take those proceeds when they sell the data to the pharmaceutical industry and help Sarah. That's a completely different organization model. And these are the types of technologies that allow that. Inside of there is big data. Inside of there is cognitive. Inside of there is mobile. Inside of there is encryption. Inside of there is IoT. Inside of it is drones and everything you can think about. But this arrangement is different. And this is what we really have to start thinking about. Another one is philanthropy. I'm running out of time. I got about 2 minutes. Okay? You think about philanthropy. This is a website that allows you to look at major donations in the world of all types. You go to the Chronicle of Philanthropy online. You can choose health, you can see who the donor was, and you can run reports, and you can see things like this. This is 2015, all money donated to health. These are the ones that report, obviously, right? You can almost look at this, and you start to think about, well, how does supply and demand really work in healthcare donation? How do the people who donate actually know that the funds are being used for the things that they think they're going to be used for? And how do the people who want to donate, that don't trust that the funds will be used properly, get that confidence that they could, and as a result, we get the micro donations to come up and actually accelerate healthcare? It's in things like trust, consensus, and autonomy that we can drive fulfillment of donations. So these are just some few cases that I want you to think about. There's a lot more going on. But recognize that there's a paradigm coming that is institutional, that operates at the bottom layer of commerce, that's really going to change the way we organize. Okay? It's an institutional revolution, not an information revolution. We're not good at it. It looks like this. It changes power to the edge of the network. We need to figure out how to build businesses that will leverage the power that's the edge of the network. It kind of makes us wonder whether we organize the right way today or not. If you guys don't walk away with that, at least you walk away with red shoes, right? Okay? And it's sitting over there, accelerating all the rest of paradigms. The competitive landscape of this particular industry is going to change quite a bit when people start to take advantage of these new models. We need to really think about our vulnerability. I hope that the rest of the remarks today help us see the future a little bit more clearly so that we can understand vulnerability. We need to remember that our personal ways of thinking about vulnerability shouldn't be applied to the corporate environment, and we need to read a lot. Read is in the word ready. You got that, sir? There's a lot more stuff going on outside of healthcare. There's tons of, I think it's like 1,000 blockchain companies have been funded already by venture capital groups outside of healthcare. There's some inside of healthcare. And as my colleagues come on stage and talk to you about the rest of what we're going to do, I want you to think about those paradigms, how you jump off a cliff, and how you have to grow wings on the way down, and recognize that the blueprint is that there's an institutional change coming in the way we organize, and it's going to set up different networks to create value. I thank you very much for your time. You've been a great audience.